These two ladies were unalived in 1987. The perpetrator remained on the loose for the next 33 years, but his eventual arrest would lead to one of the most gruesome discoveries in British criminal history. Hello there, strangers. This is part 15 of the England's Whole Lifers series, so viewer discretion, as always, is advised. Today we will be discussing typically dark topics such as SAs, Rs, unalivings, but also today we will be delving into one of the darkest aspects of criminality. So if you are in any way sensitive, I suggest you skip this video. If you're sticking with me, then let's get to it. Today I'm going to be telling you about the case of David Fuller. David was born on the 4th of September 1954, and I don't know exactly where he grew up or where he was born, but he was in trouble in school for starting fires, and he would later be in trouble with the police for stealing bicycles. He had a string of arrests in the 1970s for burglaries, and he trained as an electrician and maintenance man at the Navy shipyards in Portsmouth, Hampshire. David was married 3 times, although there's very little information about his marriages. He trained, as I'd said, as an electrician and maintenance man. He then went on to work at the Kent and Sussex Hospital as an electrician and maintenance man from 1989 till 2011, when it closed and he was transferred to Tunbridge Wells Hospital, which is in Pembury, which is around 40 miles southeast of London. There's not much information about what led up to this or how he even knew her, but David's first victim was Wendy Nell. She was 25 years old and living in a bedsit in Tunbridge Wells after the breakdown of her marriage. She worked at a photo shop called Super Snaps, and on the evening of the 22nd of June 1987, she was dropped home by her boyfriend after a night out. Unfortunately, the next morning, her body was discovered in her bedsit and she had been SA'd, beaten and unalived by strangulation. Neighbours had heard nothing despite this being a bedsit, and police had no leads. That brings us to Caroline Pierce, who was 20 years old, also lived in Tunbridge Wells in a bedsit, and she worked in a popular local restaurant called Buster Brown's. Caroline disappeared some 5 months after Wendy's unaliving, and there had been reports from her neighbours that they'd heard screaming coming from her doorstep. Caroline's remains would be found around 3 weeks later in a ditch. She was entirely unclothed except for her tights, and her remains were found in Romney Marsh, around 40 miles away from Tunbridge Wells. There had been some forensics found at the scene of Wendy's unaliving by way of a fingerprint on a shopping bag and also a footprint that had been left on a blouse in Wendy's bedsit. The footprint had been left in Wendy's life fluid. There had also been some DNA found on Caroline's tights by the way of male bodily fluid. But of course, being 1987, DNA just wasn't what it is today, and there wasn't really much they could do with the samples that they had. In fact, the National DNA Database would not even be created until 8 years after these unalivings took place. Also, because of the time that they were working in, they couldn't trace mobile phones, there was no CCTV, and so the cases went cold quite quickly. The case went cold, but they never closed it, and by 2019, advancements in science and DNA technology meant that the sample taken from Caroline's tights, which was previously unusable, could now be considered viable, and they decided to take that sample and use familial DNA to see if they could find a match in the database. This massively narrowed down their search, and then they could use historical records to see if any viable suspects were in the area at the time, and they also matched the list. They came up with David Fuller's sister as a DNA match to that sample, and that was enough to finally arrest him. They make the arrest on the 3rd of December 2020, and David denies everything, but this dude is a meticulous weirdo and has basically documented his entire life using photographs, diaries. There were old floppy disks, hard drives, a load of computer software and hardware from the 80s. He basically hoarded every single detail of his entire life, which was very useful for the police, and I'm so happy he did that. But when I say the police had a lot to work through, there were like 2,200 obsolete storage disks. There were 34,000 photographs, printed photographs. They had a lot to sift through. And as I said, David denied everything in the interviews, but they had his diaries, which showed that he was a regular customer at Buster Brown's, which is where Caroline Pierce worked. It showed that he'd been to Super Snaps, which was where Wendy Nell worked. And it also showed that he'd actually lived on the same street as Wendy prior to her moving in. But during their search, they also found something else suspicious. These are 4 hard drives that David had screwed to the back of a small chest of drawers, as you can see here, very well hidden, but not well enough. Now, of course, police were looking for evidence in the unalivings of Wendy and Caroline, and sifting through David's photographs, they came across one of him laying face down on a picnic blanket, and he'd been kicking his feet up in the air, and so the soles of his shoes were visible. Police were able to match those shoes to the footprint that was found on the blouse at Wendy's. They definitely had their man. But boy, did they have more than they had ever bargained for. Because on those 4 hard drives, David had filmed himself committing literally untold amounts of SAs. These SAs and Rs were particularly unusual as he had committed them in his place of work. Now, remember, David worked as an electrician and a maintenance man at the hospital. He had an all-access staff card, which obviously allowed him access to all areas of the hospital. David was committing these SAs and Rs in the morgue. He filmed himself doing things to people's unalived bodies numerous times, and this had been going on for years. He was totally indiscriminate. His victims ranged from 9 to 100 years old. He was able to commit these just disgusting, inhumane offences because there's no CCTV in morgues in hospitals for the privacy of the unalive. I really hope the police that had to watch those videos were provided some serious psychological support, because so in 2021, David Fuller pled guilty to the 2 unalivings and to 44 charges of SA relating to 78 different females between 2008 and 2020. Just 4 years later, he would plead guilty to a further 23 counts of SA against further women, further unalive women. One of these ladies was SA'd just 7 hours after her passing. One had worked at Bletchley House in World War II. One was 9, one was 100. He would return to particular victims numerous times. He would film himself doing all of this. I'm just in disgust, just speechless. This is considered one of the worst cases of its kind anywhere in the world. And what's worse is that we really don't know how many victims there were. I mean, this man started working the hospitals in 1989. He was not caught until 2020. Look, he was placed on the whole life offenders list, rightfully so. I cannot believe he went undetected for all of those years, committing such horrific, just inhumane crimes. I found this one hard. Look, RIP to his 2 victims, and I hope the families of the further over 100 at least victims found peace. I don't know how. Thanks for staying with me, and I'll see you for the next one.